Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel on Yis Hashem. Today, we will be learning Daf Lamed Amud Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We're going to pick up today on Lamed Amud Beis, top line, Siman Reish Nun Tes Sif Beis. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanasuna Batzaru Bashivya, Ha'imdim Bein Bayama Bein Bayabasha, Ha'malkim Yerachem Aleihem V'Yetziim Mitzar L'Revacha Me'afelu L'Oira U'Mishiba L'Gula Hashta Bagala V'Zman Kariv V'Neimar Amen. Our learning should also be a schus L'Ili Nishmas Reb David ben Reb Chaim Zichroina L'Vracha. So, we started Siman Reish Nun Tes yesterday, and we've been learning the practical shilas that come up when the halachas of muktzah and the halachas of hatmana intersect. You're going to do hatmana on your food. You're going to insulate your pot of food so that it should remain hot for Shabbos. And we know that in order to do this, you have to be using a davar she'enoi moisef hevel. You have to be using some kind of insulating material that does not generate and add heat to the food that's being insulated. And now you're looking for something to use to do your hatmana. We spoke out yesterday in the Shulchan Aruch that there are times when you may choose an insulating material which is actually muktzah. Now let's remember, you're doing this hatmana on Erev Shabbos. You're not doing it on Shabbos. On Shabbos, hatmana lechatchila is always aser, even if you're using materials that are einoi moisef hevel. So you're doing your hatmana on Erev Shabbos. So handling the insulating materials that might be muktzah on Erev Shabbos is no issue. There's no issue of muktzah on Erev Shabbos. Problem comes up if you used materials that were muktzah. Now on Shabbos you want to get your soup out. How are you going to get your soup out? How are you going to manipulate this material that is muktzah? Now, before we go weiter into Sif Beis, I just want to remind you of two things from Sif Aleph. There are two types of materials that we mentioned in Sif Aleph. One was muchin. We said that muchin are little scraps of different types of textiles or fabrics. They could be pullings of raw unprocessed cotton. They could be pullings of wool. They could be shredded pieces, little pieces of worn out garments. Now, like I mentioned yesterday, to us, this sounds like junk. But back in the day, this was not junk. These were valuable. They were saved up and they were used in order to create levadin, to create items made out of felt, to make flocking. But this was valuable material. And as such, it has a default status of a davar that is muktzah machmas chisaron kis. This is something that has value, and it has a default designated use, which is a non-Shabbos use. Its default usage is to use it to create garments, to create different types of fabric, and this is malacha that you cannot do on Shabbos. So when you look at a box of muchin, what you're looking at is something that has a designated non-Shabbos use, and it's something of value. You wouldn't just take these muchin and just use it for something else. Therefore, these muchin have a status of something which is muktzah machmas chisaron kis. Therefore, the Shulchan Aruch said, if it's 10 minutes before Shabbos, you're searching around the kitchen, oy vey, I have to do atmana on the chicken soup. What am I going to use? You see a box of muchin, you pull out the muchin and you use it for hatmana. That the fact that you now chose to use it for hatmana, that is not an act of hachana. That is not an act of being miyached the muchin and turning it into non-muktzah hatmana material. The default usage of muchin to make levadin, the default non-Shabbos usage of these muchin overrides the fact that you now chose to use it for hatmana, and it remains muktzah. So that was one item that we spoke about, muchin. Then we spoke about another item. We spoke about gizei tzemer. Gizei tzemer are sharings of wool. Now, sharings of wool, the Mishnah Berurah told us, are actually a little bit less valuable than the muchin. The default usage of gizei tzemer is that you're going to spin it into thread. You're going to use it to weave fabric. That is the default usage. But gizei tzemer have a lot of different usages. One of the usages of gizei tzemer could be to use it as hatmana material. The default usage to use it for tfiyah and ariga, to use it for spinning thread and weaving cloth, is not so powerful. It's perfectly suitable to use for hatmana material, and people would use gizei tzemer for hatmana material. Therefore, if even b'mikre you just picked up some gizei tzemer and used it for hatmana, that is sufficient to be miyachid it for Shabbos use, and now it's not muktzah. The exception to this rule would be, let's say you happen to be a wool merchant, and you shear your sheep for the distinct purpose of getting wool, which you then put into your oitzer, you put it into your warehouse, and you sell it. So for you, gizei tzemer is oimid l'schaira. This is something, this is a commodity, this is merchandise, this is inventory. Then that also is muktzah machmas chesaron kis, and that would elevate the gizei tzemer to the same status as the muchen. In order to be miyachid it for Shabbos use, you would have to be miyachid it, you would have to designate it, you would have to take it and decide these gizei tzemer, which normally would be oimid l'schaira, or these muchen, which normally would be oimid for levadin, I am using this as my hatmana material. And the Mishnah Berurah said, la'olam. What you're doing is you're taking a box of muchen and you're saying, these muchen, this is not b'mikra anymore. These muchen, this is now my hatmana material that I'm going to keep in the kitchen cabinet for use at Erev Shabbos. These gizei tzemer, even though I'm a wool merchant, and normally gizei tzemer are oimid l'schaira, these gizei tzemer, I'm being miyachid them la'olam to be my hatmana material. Okay, so here we had a difference between muchen and gizei tzemer. Muchen, on the one hand, have a very powerful, overriding, default non-Shabbos use, and therefore they're muktzah. And in order to take off the status of muktzah, you would have to be miyached that material for permanent hatmana use. Gizei tzemer, if you're not a wool merchant, gizei tzemer don't have such a powerful, overriding non-Shabbos use. And therefore, even though they're muktzah, if you take it to use it for hatmana, even once, that's sufficient to now make it non-muktzah. Okay, with that, against that backdrop, let's go to Sif Beis, where we're going to learn about another type of material. Says the Mechaber Sif Beis, top line, Lamed Amud Beis. Hanoistim avanim ulevenim. Somebody who takes stones or pieces of bricks and he places them saviv hakadera, around the pot, to use them for hatmana. So you're doing hatmana with rocks and with pieces of bricks. Says the Mechaber, tzarich sheyachadem lekach la'olam. This is like muchen. In order for them to be non-muktzah, you would have to be miyached these rocks and these pieces of brick for permanent hatmana use. Otherwise, they're muktzah. So even if you took it on Erev Shabbos 5 minutes before Shkia and you used it for hatmana, that usage alone is not enough to take away the muktzah status. It's still muktzah. You want to take away the muktzah status, you have to be miyached it, set it up in a box, put it in the kitchen cabinet. These are my hatmana stones and my hatmana bricks. Why, says the Mechaber? Why do the stones and the bricks have such an overriding non-Shabbos use? Explains the Mechaber, and this is almost the direct opposite of muchen. Shaharei kolzman shalayichadon, because says the Mechaber, as long as you are not miyached these stones and these bricks for permanent hatmana use, einam chashuvim loy. This is taka junk. This is taka garbage. Umashlichon. You're going to use it for hatmana this Friday, and then Motzei Shabbos, you know what you're going to do with it? You're going to throw it in the garbage heap. So it's garbage. Garbage is muktzah. And this is real junk. So it has an overriding default status of being muktzah. What kind of muktzah? Muktzah machmas gufay. It's junk. It's like eitzim va'avanim that have no Shabbos use. So you took stones and pieces of bricks to use them for hatmana. It's very nice. You're going to turn around and you're going to say, what do you mean? I'm using it for hatmana. Isn't that yichud for hatmana? No, it's like the muchen. The overriding status of muktzah machmas gufa in this case, by muchen, It's an overriding status of muksa machmas chesaron kis. It's valuable. It has a chosh of a non-Shabbos use. Over here, the overriding muksa status is muksa machmas gufay. It's not valuable. It's junk. It's eitzim va'avonim. And you can't override that and take away the muksa status simply by using it once for hatmana. You want to take off the muksa status, you have to designate it permanently for hatmana use. Continues the Mechaber. This being the case, Hilkach, therefore, Asr l'taltalon. You're not going to be allowed to be metaltal these stones and these bricks to get your chicken soup pot out. Unless you set them up permanently to be your hatmana stones and your hatmana bricks. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Yod, lakach la'olam. You would have to be miyached these stones and pieces of brick for permanent hatmana use. Hainu, this means, says the Mishnah Berurah, sheyiyachedei me erev Shabbos. Remember, you have to do this yichud, you have to designate it on erev Shabbos before Ben Hashmashos. Otherwise, migui dis katsoy leben Hashmashos is katsoy lekula yumakula. So you would have to set them up me erev Shabbos lahat bin behem tamid, to use this on a consistent basis for hatmana material. Because if not, tomorrow when you want to get your food out of the hatmana, you're not going to be allowed to manipulate it. You're not going to be allowed to be metaltal it because of hilchas muktzah. V'chein, similarly, another case where this comes up, says the Mishnah Berurah, eitzim ha'oimdim lahasaka. Let's say you have firewood. Firewood is muktzah. It's designated for a non-Shabbos use. You can't do havara on Shabbos. So firewood is muktzah. V'chein eitzim ha'oimdim lahasaka. If you have firewood, yizayer, take care. Milistein behem piatan or be'erev Shabbos. Don't use firewood to block up the opening to the oven on erev Shabbos, because firewood is muktzah. On Shabbos, you're not going to be allowed to remove that firewood and unblock the opening to the oven to get your food out. Why? Didn't I use it to close up the door of the oven? That's not yichud. You didn't take off the overriding status of this wood, which is firewood, which is muktzah. You didn't take that off simply by virtue of the fact that you used it one time to block up the door to the oven. So if you do this, you're going to have a problem. Ois Katan Yod Aleph, the Mechaber explained that the avonim and the levanim are junk. Motzei Shabbos, when you don't need them for hatmana anymore, you're literally going to throw them on the garbage heap. Ois Katan Yod Aleph, umashlichan. Hainu, this means the la'achish and ishtamish behen, after you use them for hatmana on Shabbos, haderech la'ashlichan l'chutz. You're going to throw them out in the garbage. Shein aleim shem kli, they're not kalim. Ve'enam chashuvim, they're not valuable. Val kein heim b'chlal muktzah. So they're muktzah. Garbage is muktzah. The adam maktzah daite mehem. You separate yourself from it. You have no intent on using it for Shabbos usage. So since these pieces of brick and these stones have an overriding status of junk, they're muktzah machmas gufay. And you can't override that by a one-time use b'mikreh for hatmana. But let's say you have stones that you always use on top of the kira to retain heat. Those stones, those stones that you keep on top of your kira on a consistent basis and you use them all the time, that's not junk. That's something that you were miyached. You might not have, verbally been miyached them and say, behold, this stone is for kira use, but you've been using it on top of your kira for 6 months. So it's now a kira stone. That is not muktzah. Now we turn to Sif Gimel, 3 lines down here on Lamed Amud Beis. Says the Mechaber, Ha'toimen bekupa maleo gizei tzemer she'asr l'taltal. Let's say you go ahead and you do hatmana by lining a box with gizei tzemer that are asr l'taltal, gizei tzemer that are muktzah. So this is what we saw yesterday, and I mentioned it already at the beginning of this year. When are gizei tzemer muktzah? When they're oimid l'schaira. If you're a wool merchant, so your gizei tzemer are inventory. They're business commodities. So they're muktzah machmas chesaron kis. So let's say you went ahead to do hatmana, and you lined a box with gizei tzemer, but gizei tzemer that are muktzah. So now you have a problem. You did hatmana on erev Shabbos with these gizei tzemer that are muktzah. You put your chicken soup pot in it. What do you do now? Says the Mechaber, Hatoimin bekupa malaya gizei tzemer she'asr l'taltal v'hoitzi hakidera. And now you took the pot out. How did you take the pot out? So the truth is, We explained yesterday how you took the pot out. You had a box. It was lined on the bottom and on all four sides with these muktzah gizei tzemer. You put in your chicken soup, and then on top, you laid down another gizei tzemer, which is muktzah. How did you get the pot out? The handle of the pot lid was exposed. You did tiltel min atzad. You picked up the lid of the chicken soup pot by its exposed handle, and the muktzah gizei tzemer that were on top fell off. So you got your chicken soup pot out. But now you have another problem. The problem is that Kolzman, the chicken soup pot, was in the box. It might have been supporting the gizei tzemer that were on the sides. When you took the chicken soup pot out, the gizei tzemer might have fallen into the cavity that's left behind after you remove the chicken soup pot. Now, you want to put the chicken soup pot back after you took chicken soup. Now, you're allowed to do that. That's not a shaila of chazara. We learned earlier that you're allowed to do chazara. If you had a pot that you did hatmana on Erev Shabbos, and you did hatmana with a davar she'ena ma'asev hevel, on Shabbos, you could uncover it, and then you could recover it. So there's no chazara issue here. So you did hatmana with these gizei tzemer on Erev Shabbos, and now on Shabbos you took the pot back. Al stadinim of chazara, you're allowed to put the pot back inside. But now you have a muktzah problem. When you took the pot out, the muktzah gizei tzemer fell into the cavity. How could you put the chicken soup pot back in now? The answer is, you can't, says the Mechaber. HaTorah bekupa malaya gizei tzemer she'asel l'taltal. You did hatmana by lining a box with gizei tzemer that were muktzah because they're limud l'schayra. V'haitzi hakdera. And now you took out the pot. Says the Mechaber, calls man shaloinis kalkala haguma, as long as the cavity doesn't get ruined, meaning the gizei tzemer that are muktzah stay up against the sides, yochal hachzira. You want to put the pot back in? Go ahead, gegezunteheit. Put the pot back in. No problem. That chazara is mutter, and there's no muktzah issue because you don't have to be metaltal. The pieces of gizei tzemer, they stayed up against the sides. But v'im niskalkala. But if the pieces of gizei tzemer collapsed into the cavity, lo yachzirena. Now you can't put the chicken soup pot back again. Why? Because you can't lift up the gizei tzemer and put them back against the walls because they're muktzah. Says the Mechaber, va'afilu lichatchila yachal lahoitzi al das lahachzira im lo tiskalkal. You don't have to worry. On Shabbos, you could take the chicken soup pot out of this box, and you could have in mind that if the gizei tzemer stay upright, you're going to put the chicken soup pot back. Why would you think that you can't do that? Explains the Mechaber. You might think that there's a room here for a gzeira. Maybe we should say, since the halacha is that if the gizei tzemer collapse, you're not allowed to put the chicken soup pot back in because you can't stand up the gizei tzemer again. So maybe we should say, you can't take the chicken soup pot out because maybe you'll take it out, and then maybe it'll collapse, and then maybe you'll be metaltal them to put them back upright and put the chicken soup back in. So that would be an interesting gzeira. Says the Mechaber, we don't make such a gzeira. You could go ahead, you could take it out, and you could try your luck. If it doesn't collapse, you'll be able to put it back. If it does collapse, you won't be able to put it back. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting Yud Beis. She'asel l'taltal. The Mechaber started off this case by saying you're using gizei tzemer that are asur l'taltal. So those are gizei tzemer that are muktzah. Why are they muktzah? Explains the Mishnah Berurah. Hainu oisam shehuktzah l'schara v'chanal b'sef aleph. These are the gizei tzemer of the wool merchant that we spoke about yesterday. These are gizei tzemer that are inventory. They're oimid l'schara, and therefore they're muktzah machmas chisar and kiss. As long as the cavity does not collapse, as long as the gizei tzemer don't fall into the middle of the box, you could put the chicken soup pot back in after you took it out. You could put something that was mutman, if you did hatmana on a pot on Erev Shabbos, and now on Shabbos you took it out of the hatmana, you're allowed to put it back into the hatmana on Shabbos. This is a halacha that a lot of people don't know. People think that they wrap up the chicken soup pot on Erev Shabbos. Once it gets unwrapped, they're not allowed to rewrap it. That's not the halacha. We learned that earlier in Rachel and Zion. You're allowed to rewrap it. That's what you're doing here. You took it out. You want to put it back? That's fine. There's no yisur of chazara. Ukidila'el b'Rachel and Zion sif dalad. Ois cut your dalad. However, v'im niskalkala, But if the cavity gets ruined because the gizei tzemer collapse, shenaflu agizin shemikanu mikan limikoy moshav hakdera, if the pieces of gizei tzemer collapse and they fall into the cavity from the sides to the place where the pot had been sitting, now you're not going to be able to put the chicken soup pot back. You know why? Explains the Mishnah Berurah. Or lekach lo yachsirena, you're not going to be allowed to put it back levisha mezes esagizin shehu muktzah, because in order to put it back, you're going to have to be metaltal the muktzah pieces of gizei tzemer, which you're not allowed to do. Let's finish off Sif Gimel over here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down near the end of the line. V'yesh oimrim. There's an interesting chumrah over here that the Mishnah Berurah really is quiet about. So the Mechaber has a very interesting chumrah. V'yesh oimrim. There are those that say, this is brought down from a Rambam in the Pirush HaMishnayos La Rambam. Says the Mechaber, V'yesh oimrim, there's a Rambam that says, Sha'afilu taman b'davar shemutar l'taltal. Even if you did your hatmana, you lined the box with materials that are not muktzah. So let's say you used gizei tzemer that are not muktzah. You're not a wool merchant. These gizei tzemer were not oimid l'schayra. They're just gizei tzemer that you had laying around. So with that, we said yesterday, is not muktzah. So let's say you lined the box with gizei tzemer that are not muktzah. There are those that say, im niskalkal haguma, if the cavity gets ruined because the gizei tzemer collapse, Loi yachzir. You're still not allowed to put the pot back into the box. Why not? What's the problem? The gizei tzemer aren't muktzah. There's no reason you can't stand them up back against the sides and put the pot in. Says the Mechaber, because of a very interesting, different concept. Mipnei shetitztarech hakedera lasais la'atzma mokaim. The kedera is going to have to find a new position. It's going to have to reseat itself into the bottom of the box. The fascinating chumrah, which l'chayra, and I'm surprised that the Mishnah Berurah didn't speak this out. I'm thinking that l'chayra really only applies, according to the Shitas HaMechaber, who's makbid on hatmana b'miktzas. I'll tell you what I mean. What the Mechaber is saying, according to the Rambam, is like this. You took the chicken soup pot out of the box. Now, if you would look into the box now, right after you took the chicken soup out, you know what you would see in the bottom of the box? You would see a depression. You lined the bottom of the box with gizei tzemer. Now, you were smart. You used gizei tzemer that are not muktzah. But if you look in the box now, what are you going to see? You're going to see a depression the size and shape of the chicken soup pot. The chicken soup was sitting on the gizei tzemer, and it pushed in and it made a recess in the gizei tzemer on the bottom. Now, when the chicken soup pot is out of the box for a while, the tendency is that the gizei tzemer on the bottom will fluff up again. When you now take the pot and reposition it back into the box that's lined with the gizei tzemer, you know what's going to happen? It's going to form a new depression, and it's going to sink in to the gizei tzemer. Says the Rambam, that looks like hatmana lechatchila on Shabbos, because it's going into a depression that didn't exist before. It existed before, but then it popped back up. Now when you put it back in, it's making a new depression. So that looks like hatmana lechatchila. Now I'm thinking that this really is only true according to the Mechaber, which makes sense because the Mechaber likes to follow the Rambam. But so that's why he would bring this Yeshayimrim, because it's only the Rambam, it's only the Mechaber that's makbid on hatmana b'miktzas. L'chayra, this concern that we have with the new depression in the bottom of the box is only hatmana b'miktzas. So be that as it may, Mishnah Berurah doesn't speak about this. Let's go weiter. Sif Dalet. Says the Mechaber, very practical here. Taman b'davar she'enoi nital. Let's say, again, you're using a box, and you're lining the box on the bottom, on all four sides, and then you're going to cover the pot after you put it in, also with hatmana material. So let's say taman, you lined the bottom of the box and the sides. That's what the Mechaber means there when he says taman. Taman b'davar she'enoi nital. For that, you used muktzah material. Maybe you used muchin, or maybe you used gizei tzemer that were oimid l'schayra. So for the bottom and for the four sides, you used muktzah material. Vikisa pia, but then you closed up the top, bedavar hanitol, with gizet semer that are not muktzah. Okay, says the Mechaber, you're sitting pretty. Megala hakisui, you could uncover the pot because the top covering is not muktzah. Va'oichiz biktera, reach in, grab hold of the pot, and umaitzia, pull it out. Very practical. The Mechaber is pointing out that you have no issue here. A little bit, it's funny even why the Mechaber has to say it. The only thing I can think is that the reason the Mechaber is saying it is because you might think it's very nice that the piece on top is not muktzah. So I took it off. But now when I take the chicken soup pot out, maybe the muktzah stuff is going to fall in. Maybe that's an issue. No, that would only be tiltal ben atzad. It's not even tiltal ben atzad because you have absolutely no intent of moving that. But be that as it may, what the Mechaber is saying is perfectly understandable. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in tezvav. Bedavar she'enei nitol. So you lined the box on the bottom and on all four sides with muktzah material. Says the Mishnah Berurah, she'nasan dvar muktzah savav hakdera. Going around the pot, you used materials that are muktzah. Okay. Now, says the Mishnah Berurah, how about if we tweak the case a little bit? V'im taman bedavar hanitol. Let's say the opposite case. Let's say you did the bottom and the sides with materials that are not muktzah. V'kisa pia, and on top you covered the top, bedavar she'ena nitol. The top you covered with material that is muktzah. Okay, says the Mishnah Berurah, what would you do? Mefane svivaiseha, pull out the materials that are on the sides. Clear out around the sides of the pot. Va'oichiz bektera, put your hands in, grab hold of the pot, umaitzia, and take the pot out. And then you'll tilt the pot, and you'll let the top covering fall off. And the Mishnah Berurah references a halacha that we learned yesterday. You're going to worry about buses? Maybe you're going to say, oh, that top piece was muktzah, so now the pot is a buses l'davar aser. No, we learned yesterday that's not true. The loy nasis buses lehen. The pot does not become a basis to the muktzah material on top of it, because the pot is not subjugated to the muktzah material. Adarabah, the muktzah material is subjugated to the pot. And then you'll shake or tilt the pot, and the muktzah material that had been on top will fall off. Tilta banatzad, it's mutter. Let's go to Sivav. Says the Mechaber. Yom Tov shechal lihiyos be'erev Shabbos. Thursday and Friday, let's say here in Chutz La'aretz, were Yom Tov. So Friday, Erev Shabbos, is a Yom Tov day. And now Shabbos is Shabbos. Okay, what does this have to do with Atmana? Says the Mechaber. Yom Tov shechal lihiyos be'erev Shabbos. Let's say Yom Tov falls out on Erev Shabbos. Yesh mi she'oiser lahatbin ba'avanim. There are those that say that on Yom Tov, you would not be allowed to do hatmana around your pot using stones. Why not? Very interesting reason. Mishum dehevi kamay binyan, because it's like binyan. What are you doing? You're arranging stones and you're piling up stones in a cylinder around your chicken soup pot. There are those that say that that's binyan, and it would be aser. V'yesh patirim, but there are those that say that this is mutter. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut into Zayin. Lahatmin ba'avanim. There are those that say that you cannot do atmana with stones on Yom Tov. So if Erev Shabbos is Yom Tov, you got a problem. You can't use stones. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Hainu afilu im yichadon lekach mikvar deles behen misho muktzah. This is not a muktzah issue. Even if you designated these stones to be your hatmana stones, la'olam, so they're not muktzah. There's a different problem. What's the problem? He's cutting Yud Zayin. Mishum dehevi hainu desider ha'avanim. This that you're arranging the stones around the pot, dehevi k'may doifen. It's like you're building walls around the pot. Hevi b'chlal binyan arai. That's called building a binyan arai, a temporary flimsy structure. V'aser b'drabanan b'yom tov. Binyan arai is an iser b'drabanan. But there are those that say that this is mutter. Sfir lehu, they hold the mishum kavod Shabbos like Osru. Because of kavod Shabbos, this iser d'Rabbanan would not be in place. But if you have other items that you could use for your hatmana, if you have gizei tzemer that are not muktzah, if you have a coat that you could use for hatmana, don't use the stones. Also l'kuli alma. V'ayin be'el yerabish kasav shaminiki yesh patirim v'chein kasav hagraz. Let's go to Siv Zayin. Says the Mechaber Siv Zayin. Tanur shemanichin by hachamin. You have a tanur, and you put hot food inside the bottom of the tanur on Erev Shabbos. Ayin la'el, the halachas of shehiyah. So tanur shemanichin by hachamin, you have a tanur, and you're putting hot food inside the bottom of the tanur. This soisbin piv, now you want to close up the door to the tanur because you want the tanur to retain the heat. V'soisbin piv bedaf, you're closing up the opening of the tanur with a board. V'shorkin, pirish machlikin, and now you're smearing oisai petit. You're taking clay. We learned about this, right? A tanur that's tuach petit. If it's tuach petit, you take away all of the chshashas of shemi yechata b'gechalim. So that's what you're doing. You put your chamin inside the tanur. Now you took a piece of plywood and you put it up against the opening of the tanur, and now you're taking some clay or some lime or whatever it is, and you're smearing with a trowel. You're being tuach oisai petit. You're sealing it closed with clay or with some kind of mud. Now, you want to open it to get your food out. Says the Mechaber, mutter lister oisa stima, you're allowed to bust open that closing kedei lahoitzi achamin, in order to take your hot food out. Not only that, another halacha, velachzar ulasasmai, you could also go ahead and reclose it on Shabbos. Two different halachas here, two different chidushim. We'll see in the Mishnah Berurah. But if inside this tanur you have actual glowing coals or glowing embers, then mutar al yedei eina Yehudi. Then you're allowed to have an eina Yehudi go ahead, open and close. Let's take a look here, see the Mishnah Berurah, and see what's behind this. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut yotes. Mutter listar. So the first halacha the Mechaber said was, you went ahead and you closed up the opening to the tanur with a daf, a wooden board, and you smeared clay to seal it closed. You're allowed to bust it open to get your hot pot out. Says the Mishnah Berurah, she'ein zeh bechlal stiras binyan afilu midrabanan. You might think that there's an Issa Malacha over here. What's the Issa Malacha? Stira. There are two Avis Malachas at Shabbos, Binyan and Stira. You might think that this is Stira. This is demolishing. You're demolishing a binyan. Now, it's not a real binyan, because when you closed up this doorway, it was never intended to be a binyan shel kayama. It wasn't a permanent structure. It was only a temporary closure of an opening that you know you're going to have to open up. So it definitely wouldn't be stira daraisa. But you might think it's stira darabanan. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. The Mechaber is telling you it's not. She'ein zeh bechlal stiras binyan afilu midarabanan kevin shaloi naseh likiyum klal. Because the Taz brings down that this closure wasn't made likiyum klal. When you closed it up, you knew very well that you're soon busting it open to get your pot out, and therefore it's not even arai, and it wouldn't even be stira midrabanan. So that was halacha number one. The next halacha, the Mechaber says, was then velachzar v'lasaismai. After you bust it open, if you want to reclose it, you're allowed to reclose it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, over here there's another chiddush. Says the Mishnah Berurah, velachzar v'lasasmai, hu inyan mifnei atzmai. This is an independent halacha. The Kamash Balon, the Mechaber is teaching me with this, that you need not be concerned, shema yesh bifnim kecholim loichashois. Maybe there are burning embers or glowing coals inside the tanur. When you go ahead and you close the door, we know that when you have a barbecue grill or a smoker, we know how do you raise the heat and lower the heat? By opening and closing the vents. The way you control the temperature is by giving the fire more air or restricting the air flow to the coals. So that's what's happening over here. If you have glowing coals inside the tanur, and then you put the board back on the opening and you close it back up, you're denying the fire its air. So you're going to dim the coals. That would be kivui. So when the Mechaber tells you over here that you're allowed to reclose it, you know what the Mechaber is telling you? Unless you know that there are burning coals. If you know there are burning coals, you can't close it. But if you don't know that there are burning coals, you're not mechuyev to be choishish that there are burning coals, and therefore you could go close it on Shabbos. Okay, then the Mechaber said that if if you know that there are glowing coals, the Mechaber said, if there are glowing coals, mutar al yedei eino Yehudi, then you would be allowed to have it closed up by an eino Yehudi. You wouldn't be allowed to do it yourself, but you could have an eino Yehudi do it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Chafalef mutar al yedei eino Yehudi, aval al yedei Yisrael, Asr listain. If you know that there are glowing coals, then a Yid would not be allowed to reclose the door. Why? Because you're doing kivui. You're dimming the coals by denying them air. Now, you'll ask me, very nice, I'm doing kivui, but it's a davar she'ein miskaven. I have no interest in dimming the coals. I'm closing up the door because I want the tanner to retain its heat. That's why I'm closing it up. I certainly am not interested in doing kivui, so l'chayr it's a davar she'ein miskaven. Says the Mishnah Berurah, it's still aser. Also, we should psik reisha. You're right, it's a davar she'ein miskaven, but it's a psik reisha. We know for certain that by closing up the door, you're going to dim the coals. Psik reisha is aser even by a davar she'ein miskaven. Aval, however, the Mechaber said, you're allowed to do this through the agency of an eino Yehudi. So that means that you're allowed to do Amir al-Akum, you're allowed to tell the eino Yehudi to go close the door, even though by closing the door, it's a psik reisha that he is going to do kivui. That's mutter. And the reason that's mutter is because something that we learned earlier in Reish Nun Gimel. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Aval ba'amir le'eino Yehudi lo kaptinan kulei. By Amir al-Akum, we're not concerned about a psik reisha. If what the guy is going to do is a davar she'ein miskaven, the guy is just closing the door for you. He's not doing kivui for you. He's not trying to extinguish the coals. You never asked him to extinguish the coals. But it's a psik reisha. By Amir al-Akum, we're not worried about the goy's psik reisha. We learned this earlier in Reish Nun Gimel, because when it comes to this Rabbanon, or shvus, with his no maisa being done by a Yisrael, we're not concerned with Amir al-Akum. Reish Nun Gimel sifhei ayin sham. Now, how about if you want to close up this door, and you're not going to close it all the way? Then afilu al yedei Yisrael shari de enoi mechabe. The Mishnah Berurah brings down here from the Ager and the Maharil that if you don't close the door all the way, then even you yourself are allowed to do it. Because if you do leave the door somewhat opened, then the gechalim that are loichashos are still going to have an air supply. And since they're going to have an air supply, you're not really doing kivui. The Kosev Magen Avraham, however, the Magen Avraham writes, very interesting point the Magen Avraham makes. The only time it's mutter, it's not enough that you're going to keep the door a little bit open. You have to keep the door wide open, not just a little open. Why? For a very interesting reason. But if you leave it open a crack, yesh lesar mishamavir. We've been worried until now about kibui, that when you close the door, you're denying the gechalim loichashos air, so they're going to dim. So that's kibui. Says the Magen Avraham, if you close the door but you leave it open a crack, you're going to do the opposite. You're going to do havara. How am I going to do havara? Very interesting. Take a look at the Mishnah Berurah says. The teva haruach, because it's the nature of wind, liyos mefiach derech nekev koton, to blow in through a small opening. Think about it. If you have a wide opening and you have a volume of air passing through it, it goes through gently. But if you take the same volume of air and now you narrow the opening, what happens? You have the same volume of air passing through a smaller opening. It's going to pass through with greater pressure. So when the door is open, you only have a very gentle movement of air. When you close the door and leave it open a crack, you're restricting the opening. Now the air is going to blow in. When air blows in on coals, it makes them glow. That's like using a bellows. And that's exactly what the Mishnah Berurah says. The dami lemapuach. Now it's similar to using a bellows. Umaver yoiser ataner. And now the tanner will fire up more. Me'ilu haya pasuach lagamri. It will fire up more than it would have if the door would have been opened wide. Kasav El Yerabba, the El Yerabba writes. Under pressing circumstances, mutter hayisrael listar matanor afilu b'yesh gachalam loichashois. The El Yerabah says that under pressing circumstances, even a yid would be allowed to close the door of the oven all the way, even on his own. Ki yesh lismay chadas trumas hadeshen, because we could rely on the words of the trumas hadeshen. Shemekel, who was very mekel on this, was svirle, and he held the loy have a psik reisha sheyichbu agechalam al yedei stima. It's not considered a psik reisha that by closing the doors, the coals are going to become dimmed, because it takes time for it to happen, and that's not called a psik reisha. But if there's actual fire burning inside the tanner, the Trumas Hadeshen would also agree that it would be usher to close the door, because closing the door makes the actual fire go out quickly. Vedan, you should know, says the Mishnah Berurah, this whole discussion is only germane to closing the door. But when it comes to opening the door, everybody holds that to open the door of the tanner when there are gechalim loichashois inside is usher for a yid to do. If you know that there are glowing coals, even if the doorway had not been sealed with tit, because when you open up the door, the air is going to get inside and it is going to fire up the coals. Says the Ramah, 2 lines off the bottom, Hagah, V'yesh machmirin shaloi listar stibas atanor hatuach betit al yidei Yisrael em ev shalasois al yidei any Yehudi. There are those that are machmir and say, if you closed up the oven door with a board and you sealed it with clay, then it should not be opened by a yid if there's an any Yehudi available to do it. And similarly, says the Ramah, if you don't have an Eini Yehudi, but you have a minor child, a Yid, Lo Yasa Yisrael Gadol, an adult shouldn't do it. But if you don't have a cotton to do it, you don't have an Eini Yehudi to do it, then Yasa Gadol al Yidei Shinoi K'tzas, then an adult Yisrael should do it, but he should do it with a Shinoi. He should do it in a little bit of a different way, V'hachi Nog, and that is the minig. Says the Mishnah Berurah, bottom line, Lamed Amud Beis, Oischav Beis, V'yesh machmirin, there are those that are machmir and say that a yid should not break open the door of the tanor. Taimam, their reasoning is the ulai kevin shetuach betit. Maybe once you close it up with a board and you actually go through the trouble of troweling on tit and sealing it with clay, yesh pozek tzas mishum stiras binyan. Maybe there is room over here for an issur d'Rabbanan of stiras binyan. We said that there's no stiras binyan because it's not even considered a binyan arai. It's a totally temporary thing. But there are those that say no. Since you mamish went there and sealed it with clay, maybe there's room here for an issur of stira, or lekach yesh lahachmir hecha de'efsher, and therefore, when possible, you should be machmir. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah, discussing limud HaTorah, Shemi Megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe should say, Yeshua's refuahs parnaset shedukim to those in need. We should be zeicher to see the Bias Gal Tzedek. B'mhera v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.